This freaking episode of My Hero Academia, man, it did not pull back on the domestic abuse stuff that happened within the Todoroki family. So we all know the backstory of like what happened within the Todoroki family and what Endeavor's plan was. He, you know, got together with Rei to do a quirk marriage where they would combine their quirks to ultimately have a child that would then have like this souped up ultimate quirk that combined the two. And Endeavor's whole goal was to eventually end up creating a child that would have a quirk that would eventually end up surpassing All Might's. And at first he thought that it was going to be Toya, his eldest son, and that didn't end up happening whatsoever, because ultimately what they find out is that although Toya's fire quirk is ultimately stronger than Endeavor's, the problem is that his physical body took more attributes from Rei. So ultimately, Toya's body ended up being more resistant to colder temperatures rather than hotter temperatures. And so because of that, if Toya were to ever start using his quirk, his body would become severely damaged from, him basically being on fire. His body would end up having all the burns, which is exactly why Dabi looks like the way that he does, because the overuse of his quirk, especially after he got older and it started developing even more, it became even stronger once it turned from red to blue. That's why Dabi looks like the way that he does now. The overuse of his quirk has ultimately just destroyed his body, and he's just completely covered with burn marks. And at this point, Endeavor had already instilled the mindset that he wanted Toya to become stronger than All Might. He wanted Toya to end up becoming the future #1 hero. And this ultimately became an obsession for Toya, and Endeavor did not like this. He did not want that to end up happening for his child, because he already knew that it wasn't possible, right? He already knew that it wasn't possible, so he wanted Toya to end up giving up on that goal. But Toya didn't want to do that. He just was completely adamant about it, and he continued to keep trying to train and improve his quirk. And the only thing that Endeavor could end up trying to figure out how to get him to stop was to end up having more children. And that's ultimately what kind of ended up leading towards Natsuo being born, and then eventually Shoto being born. Because if they kept on trying to finally have the child that he so desperately wanted them to have, or he wanted to have, then maybe that would eventually convince Toya that maybe continuing to seek for this goal to becoming stronger than All Might, just maybe he would finally give up on that. But it didn't happen like that. So ultimately, Toya ended up becoming even more obsessed about it, and he grew resentful of his youngest brother. And at one point, we see in the episode that he ends up, trying to attack his younger brother, and that's, really messed up. Ultimately, it just ends up becoming this whole big thing where Toya just becomes so obsessed with wanting his father's admiration and wanting to be closer to his dad in some sort of way. Ultimately, this is the biggest sin that Endeavor had committed with his family, especially with his eldest son. He didn't communicate with him. He didn't properly talk with him. He just tried to push all of that burden onto his wife, Rei. But ultimately, because she couldn't really do anything and he didn't want to listen to him, she eventually ended up becoming fearful of her own son, which led it to the growing fear of her husband and the rest of her children, which ultimately led to her going insane and lashing out. And that's why Todoroki, or Shoto, now has the burn mark on his face. And then she got admitted into a friggin' hospital where she basically lost her mind until recently, when Shoto decided to finally start trying to gain back that connection with his mom. And the whole point of the episode was to really show the true origins of what was Toya, who eventually became Dabi, but ultimately for the family, the Todoroki family, to finally accept that they all sort of played a part all together. Rei didn't do her part as a mother to try to nurture him and try to see reason. Enji, Endeavor, didn't play the role of the father properly, and he didn't try to properly communicate with him to try to get him down the proper path. Even though they tried to convince him, he wouldn't listen, but he never really truly communicated with him. Fuyumi just tried to play up appearances, tried to make it seem like everything was okay, but in reality it wasn't, and ultimately she ended up just distancing herself even more further from the family. And Natsuo, despite being the one who was the closest to Toya, ultimately ended up pushing him away as well, and pushing him in the way in the sense that he didn't try to talk with him as well, because although he was the one who was the most closest to him and understood what he was saying the most, he just sort of, he was a little kid, so he didn't really want to constantly hear about that and didn't want to talk about that. So even though his brother really needed someone to talk about that the most, but someone that he felt like that he could trust, Natsuo ultimately just pushed him away because he didn't want to talk about that anymore. He wanted to pretend like it wasn't something that was actually ended up happening. Toya went insane and he lost his mind. He felt like that his father and his mother and his family abandoned him, and that turned into a burning hatred for the entirety of his family, and that's what ultimately led to the ending result of what happened in the forest, where he burned himself alive basically, and he died, and Dabi was then born. The entire family decides to take their own piece of the blame because they all feel like that they had some part to play in this, and what ultimately led to the result of what became Dabi. They all know that they didn't do their part proper. They all know that they could have done more, but they didn't do it. Meanwhile, we have Endeavor, who's been trying to take the entire blame the entire time, and all he wants to do right now is basically just give up. But they all tell him that he can't give up. And if he wants to give up, then they'll all take a piece of the blame themselves, which they already are. And they're going to do everything that they can in order to help him get back up and get back walking and continue to try to help their son that they lost, right? To help out the world that's now completely broken apart. And not only are Endeavor's entire family going to do that, but Hawks and Best Genius are going to do that as well, because they see that Endeavor, the current Endeavor in current time, is trying to do the right thing. He's trying to be a better person. Regardless of his past mistakes, they're willing to look at who Endeavor is now and the person who he's trying to become, and they want to elevate that person up. They don't want to elevate the person that he used to be. They want to help him be by the person's side of who he is now. And that's what his entire family's trying to do. That's what, the remaining members of the Hero Society are trying to do, and they're by his side. They want to do everything they can to help Endeavor try to make sense of everything that's going on, get people's trust back within the heroes, and just ultimately rebuild the whole, the entirety of Japan, because it's all currently really freaking broken. And then ultimately, it gets the part of the episode where Hawks asks the big question of what the freaking hell is One for All. And it pretty much goes to a couple of other moments with some of the other characters. Not really, I don't really want to talk about it because it's not really worth mentioning, but we go back to All Might and Deku. They're in the hospital room, he's unconscious, and then the episode ends. And the next episode's going to be showing off Deku talking to the other vestiges of One for All, the previous wielders, and they're just going to ask him, are you ready? Are you willing to kill Tomura Shigaraki? Can he do it? And we're going to get Deku's answer in the next episode. This episode was phenomenal, right? I actually ended up crying within the episode because I said this before, Endeavor is like my favorite character in My Hero Academia. I have loved his character redemption. I've loved his journey. I've loved everything that they've done with him up to this point. He's just this phenomenal character who was a terrible person, and he realized that he was a terrible person after becoming number one, and he had to really reevaluate himself and his relationship with his family, and he had to try to become a better person. And what he had to do from there on forward was to make the people around him acknowledge that he is trying to be better. It may take a long time, but he's just going to have to accept that it is going to take a while for that to happen. But he's still going to go ahead and try to do it anyways. And now we're at this point where his family does want to be by his side. They do want to help him. Even Shoto, who wanted to be the one to take down his brother by himself, but he realized that just wasn't going to be possible, because it's not just the results it's not just his responsibility solely. It's the responsibility of his entire family to try to step up and do something and to either stop him or save him, and whatever they have to do. And I just really, really, really love this episode. I love anything they ever do with Endeavor because, like I said, he's my favorite character. But now I'm ultimately waiting how they're gonna tackle the next episode, which, you know, obviously it's just gonna be more dialogue. Obviously, we're still in like the down period where not a lot of action is going on. But I like this. You know, I like when it's just like characters growing, it's characters, you know, changing, and they're communicating, right? I love when shows can shonen action anime can do this, where they can make it two characters just talking to one another super engaging. And I feel like that really happened in this episode, even though most of the episode was just a flashback and showing off the origins of Dabi, of who he was before he became Dabi. Anyways, the episode was amazing. I loved it. I mean, like I said, I cried. You know, I got really emotional. I felt the emotions. It was pretty great. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I don't really have much else to say. They didn't hold back, right? They could have like done a lot to make the domestic abuse stuff not nearly as severe, but I feel like they showed enough to know, for the audience to know how severe it actually was, and I feel like that's all they really needed to do. Anyways, that's besides the point. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like. If you want to see more, please be sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys next one. Have a fantastic day. I'm out. Peace.